General Audience number 80 of April 28th, 1982. There are others who made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. This is how Christ expresses himself according to Matthew chapter 19, verse 12. It is a characteristic feature of the human heart to accept even difficult demands in the name of love, for an ideal, and above all in the name of love for a person. Love is, in fact, oriented by its very nature toward the person. And so, in this call to continence for the kingdom of heaven, first the disciples and then the whole living tradition of the church quickly discovered the love for Christ himself as the bridegroom of the church, bridegroom of souls, to whom he has given himself to the end. See John chapter 13, verse 1 and chapter 19, verse 30. In the mystery of his Passover and in the Eucharist. In this way, continence for the kingdom of heaven, the choice of virginity or celibacy for one's whole life, has become, in the experience of the disciples and followers of Christ, an act of particular response to the love of the divine bridegroom, and therefore acquired the meaning of an act of spousal love. That is, of a spousal gift of self with the end of answering in a particular way the Redeemer's spousal love. A gift of self understood as a renunciation, but realized above all out of love. The spousal meaning of the body is the foundation of Christ's call to continence. In this way, we uncovered all the wealth of the meaning contained in the very concise, but at the same time very profound statement of Christ about continence for the kingdom of heaven. But now we should direct our attention to the meaning these words have for the theology of the body, the biblical foundations of which we have tried to present and reconstruct from the beginning. Exactly the analysis of that biblical beginning to which Christ appealed in his conversation with the Pharisees on the subject of marriage, on its unity and indissolubility, see Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9, shortly before addressing the words about continence for the kingdom of heaven from Matthew chapter 19, verse 11 to 12, to his disciples, allows us to recall the profound truth about the spousal meaning of the human body in its masculinity and femininity, which we deduced then from the analysis of the first chapters of Genesis, especially from chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. It was exactly in this way that we had to formulate and specify what we find in those ancient texts. See TOB Audiences 13 to 19. Contemporary mentality has become accustomed to think and speak, above all, about sexual drives, thereby transferring to the terrain of human reality what is proper to the world of living beings, to the animalia. Now, a deepened reflection on the concise text of Genesis chapters 1 and 2 allows us to show with certainty and conviction that from the beginning a clear and unambiguous boundary is drawn between the world of the animals, animalia, and man created in the image and likeness of God. In that text, though it is relatively short, there is nevertheless enough room to show that man has a clear consciousness of what distinguishes him essentially from all living beings, animalia. See especially TOB Audiences 5 through 7. Thus, the application to man of this category, a substantially naturalistic one, which is contained in the concept and expression of sexual drive, is not entirely appropriate and adequate. Of course, one can apply this term on the basis of a certain analogy. In fact, man's particularity in comparison with the whole world of living beings, animalia, is not such that, understood from the point of view of species, it cannot be qualified in a fundamental way as an animal as well, but as an animal rational animal. For this reason, despite this analogy, the application of the concept of sexual drive to man, given the dual nature in which he exists as male and female, nevertheless greatly limits and in some sense diminishes what the same masculinity-femininity is in the personal dimension of human subjectivity. It limits and diminishes also that for which both the man and the woman unite so as to be one flesh. See Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. To express this appropriately and adequately, one must use an analysis different from the naturalistic one. Precisely the study of the biblical beginning puts us under the obligation to do this in a convincing way. The truth about the spousal meaning of the human body and its masculinity and femininity, deduced from the first chapters of Genesis, see especially Genesis chapter 2, verses 23 to 24, or the simultaneous discovery of the spousal meaning of the body and the personal structure of the subjectivity of man and woman, seems to be a key concept in this area, and at the same time, the only appropriate and adequate concept. Now, it is precisely in relation to this concept, to this truth about the spousal meaning of the human body, that one must reread and understand the words of Christ about continence for the kingdom of heaven, which he spoke in the immediate context of that appeal to the beginning, on which he based his teaching about the unity and indissolubility of marriage. At the basis of Christ's call to continence, there stands not only sexual drive as a category of, I would say, naturalistic necessity, but also the awareness of the freedom of the gift, which is organically connected with the deep and mature consciousness of the spousal meaning of the body in the structure of man's and woman's personal subjectivity as a whole. Only in relation to such a meaning of the masculinity and femininity of the human person does the call to voluntary continence for the kingdom of heaven find a full guarantee and motivation. Only and exclusively in such a perspective does Christ say, "Let anyone understand this who can." Matthew chapter 19, verse 12. He thereby indicates that such continence, although in every case is above all a gift, can also be understood, that is, it can be drawn and deduced from the concept man has of his psychosomatic I in its wholeness, and more specifically of the masculinity and femininity of this I, in the reciprocal relationship that is as though by nature inscribed in all human subjectivity. As we recall from the earlier analyses carried out on the basis of Genesis chapter 2, verse 23 to 25, that reciprocal relation of masculinity and femininity, that reciprocal four of man and woman, can be understood appropriately and adequately only within the dynamic whole of the personal subjectivity. Christ's words in Matthew chapter 19, verse 11 and 12 show accordingly that this four, which has been present from the beginning at the basis of marriage, can also stand at the basis of continence for the kingdom of heaven, relying on the same disposition of the personal subject, thanks to which man fully finds himself through a sincere gift of self. See Gaudium et Spes 24:3. Man, male and female, is able to choose the personal gift of self to another person in the conjugal covenant, in which they become one flesh. And he is also able to renounce freely such a gift of self to another person, in order that by choosing continence for the kingdom of heaven, he may give himself totally to Christ, on the basis of the same disposition of the personal subject, and on the basis of the same spousal meaning of being as a body, male and female. There can be formed the love that commits man to marriage for the whole duration of his life. See Matthew chapter 19, verse 3 through 9. But there can be formed also the love that commits man for his whole life to continence for the kingdom of heaven. See Matthew chapter 19, verses 11 and 12. This is what Christ speaks about in his whole statement addressed to the Pharisees, Matthew chapter 19, verse 3 through 9, and then to the disciples in Matthew chapter 19, verse 11 and 12. It is evident that the choice of marriage as it was instituted by the Creator from the beginning presupposes the consciousness and inner acceptance of the spousal meaning of the body, which is connected with the masculinity and femininity of the human person. Exactly this, in fact, what is expressed is in lapidary fashion in the verses of Genesis. As we listen to Christ's words addressed to the disciples about continence for the kingdom of heaven, from Matthew chapter 19, verse 11 and 12, we cannot think that this second kind of choice can be made in a free and conscious manner without a reference to one's own masculinity or femininity, and to that spousal meaning proper to man precisely in the masculinity or femininity of his being as a personal subject. Even more, in the light of the words of Christ, we must admit that this second kind of choice, namely continence for the kingdom of God, is made also in relation to the masculinity and femininity proper to the person who makes this choice. It is made on the basis of the full consciousness of the spousal meaning, which masculinity and femininity contain in themselves. If this choice were made by artificially prescinding from this real richness of every human subject, It would not correspond appropriately or adequately to the content of Christ's words in Matthew chapter 19, verse 11 and 12. In these words, Christ explicitly calls for full understanding when he says, "Let anyone understand this who can." See Matthew chapter 19, verse 12.